Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm really glad you're joining us today because we are getting into an analysis that directly challenges the consensus you usually see on the evening news.
We really are. It is a complete departure from the standard narrative.
Right. So our mission today is to thoroughly examine this highly provocative, honestly incredibly blunt geopolitical critique by the Dutch commentator Kees de Kort.
Yeah, he is taking a massive magnifying glass to the escalating conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States.
And his central claim is essentially a huge warning bell. De Kort argues that the West is suffering from what he calls monumental blindness.
Monumental blindness. That is strong wording.
It is monumental blindness regarding the true economic and, well, the true military realities of this specific conflict.
And I think right up front, because de Kort's analysis touches on heavily charged ongoing conflicts, we need to put our own views aside today. Our mission here isn't to endorse his worldview or, take political sides, purely to pressure test his arguments. We want to see what we can learn from this highly critical alternative perspective.
Yeah, we're just synthesizing his specific points to help you understand a narrative that is just a stark departure from the standard official lines you might be used to hearing.
Exactly. It is about understanding the argument, not necessarily agreeing with it.
Okay, let's unpack this. The source we are working from is a recent, really sharp interview where de Kort dissects the recent U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran.
And he pushes back hard against the idea that the West is in complete control of the escalation ladder here.
He does. In fact, he opens with a claim that just directly contradicts the mainstream narrative. He argues that the West has vastly underestimated Iran's broader strategy.
To the point where he predicts the U.S. and Israel will deeply regret their recent military actions.
Yeah, he bluntly states that Iran is going to win this old war.
Which is a sweeping statement. I mean, it is massive. But what is fascinating here is that de Kort isn't basing this conclusion on ideology or political maneuvering.
Right. He is not talking about morals or rights.
No. He is looking strictly at the cold, hard mathematics of military supply. He is evaluating the logistics of modern warfare.
The math.
The math. To illustrate this, he points back to a specific period of escalation in June of the previous year.
Right, I remember that.
During that exchange, de Kort claims that Israel actually ran out of defensive interceptor missiles in a span of just 10 to 12 days.
10 to 12 days, that is nothing.
Exactly. Based on his reading of the situation, Israel essentially had to beg for a halt to the incoming fire simply because their defensive stockpiles were utterly depleted.
But wait, let me push back on that for a second.
Yeah.
Because we constantly hear about these impenetrable defense shields.
The Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome, the Patriot systems. They are touted as the gold standard of military technology. How does a highly advanced, heavily backed military just run out of interceptors in under 2 weeks?
It comes down to the brutal economics of asymmetric warfare. It is not about the technology failing to work. It is about the cost.
The cost and the production rate, right?
Precisely. You are talking about a scenario where a single defensive interceptor missile might cost several $1 million. And it takes months to manufacture.
Months for one missile.
Yes. Meanwhile, the offensive weapon it is shooting down, say, an attack drone or a mass-produced rocket.
Those are cheap.
Extremely cheap. They might only cost a few $1,000s and can be churned out by the hundreds in a matter of days.
Wow.
De Kort is pointing out that you cannot win a war of attrition when your shield costs exponentially more than your adversary's sword.
That is a terrifying mathematical reality for any military commander.
Yeah.
And de Kort uses this incredibly visceral phrasing to describe it.
The knife through butter analogy.
Yes. He says that the U.S. and Israeli air defenses are currently being cut through like a knife through butter.
Yeah.
And looking at those economics, you can see why.
It completely shifts how you view the conflict.
It really does. Iran's strategy, according to this analysis, isn't to win a traditional boots-on-the-ground war. Instead, they are utilizing their deep stockpiles of cheap, offensive rockets to deliberately and systematically bankrupt Western defensive systems.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the tactical implications are staggering.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a nation, no matter how technologically advanced they are, runs out of defensive weapons, they are entirely at the mercy of their adversary.
Because they can't block anything anymore.
Right. At that point, the opposing force has free rein in the airspace. DeCourt is arguing that this reality, the sheer depletion rate of incredibly expensive interceptor missiles versus relatively cheap offensive rockets, is a massive blind spot.
He believes it is being completely ignored by Western leadership in their strategic planning.
Ignored, or they're just hoping it doesn't become the deciding factor.
And he emphasizes that it isn't just about the sheer number of missiles, it is about the map itself. The spatial strategy here is a huge part of his argument.
Geography matters.
It does. He notes that Iran is actively targeting regional bases in places like Bahrain and Iraq. And the reason for this is to dictate where the U.S. naval fleet can operate.
Right, forcing them back.
DeCourt mentions the fleet is forced to stay roughly 2,000 kilometers away, purely out of fear of these concentrated Iranian missile barrages.
Precisely. And by forcing the fleet to maintain that 2,000-kilometer buffer, Iran fundamentally changes the physics of how the U.S. can project power.
Or respond to a crisis quickly.
Exactly. It pushes the immediate threat away from Iranian borders and neutralizes those quick-strike capabilities. But more importantly, it sets the stage for the ultimate economic trump card.
The Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Right, which is the massive global choke point.
It is huge. About 20% of the world's global oil consumption passes through that narrow waterway every single day.
20%?
Every day.
Yeah.
By keeping the U.S. fleet at bay and actively depleting regional air defenses, Iran positions itself to be able to close the strait whenever they choose.
So it is not just a military victory at that point. It is the ability to paralyze global energy markets.
And DeCourt notes that once those defense systems are mathematically exhausted and the fleet is pushed back, who exactly is going to stop them from shutting it down?
Nobody.
Right. That is the monumental blindness he is referring to, failing to see the logistical endgame that leads straight to a global economic crisis.
So if the military logistics are pointing to this massive vulnerability, how does that translate to the diplomatic side? Is DeCourt seeing the same kind of blindness in how the West is justifying all this on the global stage?
He absolutely is. DeCourt moves from the tactical reality on the ground to a very sharp political critique. He points out what he sees as a glaring double standard in international relations.
The Ukraine comparison.
Yes. He draws a very uncomfortable comparison with the situation in Ukraine. He points back 4 years to when Russia invaded. The reaction from the West, as he notes, was immediate and unified.
It was instant.
Within 24 hours, there was absolute global outrage. Massive economic sanctions were deployed, and the rhetoric was entirely focused on defending international law.
The message was unequivocally, we have a rules-based international order and this violates it.
Yes.
But DeCourt contrasts that with the reaction to the U.S. and Israel bombing Iran. He points out the timeline difference. Within a day or two of those strikes, the Western world effectively treated the action as acceptable.
Right.
There was no universal outrage, no immediate flurry of global sanctions from allied nations. It was just absorbed as business as usual.
And you have to ask what the consequence of that perceived hypocrisy is, especially when viewed from outside the Western bubble. DeCourt's conclusion is brutal.
What does he say?
He argues that this double standard completely dismantles the concept of an international rules-based order.
Because you can't have rules if they only apply to your enemies.
Exactly. You cannot claim to uphold a universal standard of international law if the rest of the world sees you selectively applying it based solely on your geopolitical alliances.
Makes sense.
Because of this, DeCourt asserts that Western credibility in the eyes of the global South, and really the broader non-Western world, has dropped to absolute zero.
But does credibility really matter if you have the military might to enforce your will? I mean, historically, superpowers haven't always needed universal popularity to achieve their goals.
That is exactly where his first and second points collide.
Oh, the depleted interceptors.
Right. If you have infinite military might, perhaps you can absorb a loss of diplomatic credibility. But DeCourt just established that the military might is physically being depleted. The interceptors are running out.
Wow.
So if your military dominance is mathematically unsustainable and your diplomatic credibility is at zero, you are backing yourself into a corner where you have no leverage left.
That is a highly sobering combination. And it leads right into his critique of what the West is actually trying to achieve with this remaining leverage. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The regime change stuff.
DeCourt tackles the elephant in the room regarding Western policy toward Iran, the concept of regime change. Specifically, he reacts to the frequently discussed goal of assassinating top Iranian spiritual leaders.
With the hope that taking off the head of the government will naturally trigger a pro-Western revolution inside the country.
Right.
DeCourt views this as an incredibly naive fantasy. He says it is completely detached from historical and cultural realities.
He emphasizes that Western strategists often make the mistake of treating Iran like a fragile banana republic. Like it will just collapse into a compliant democracy if you remove a few key figures.
Which ignores the fact that Iran is a massive, wealthy nation with a deeply rooted, proud history and a highly complex cultural identity.
But to play devil's advocate here, we see protests in Iran constantly. The world has watched massive internal pushback against the regime over human rights, the economy, religious laws.
Right, there's real anger there.
A lot of people inside Iran are deeply unhappy with their government. So why wouldn't taking out a top hardline leader serve as the catalyst those citizens need to take back their country?
Well, DeCourt acknowledges that internal dissatisfaction is a reality. But he argues there is a massive difference between citizens protesting their own government and those same citizens welcoming a foreign power assassinating their leadership.
That makes sense. It is one thing to fight your own leaders, another to have an outsider bomb them.
Exactly. He warns that taking out a top Shia spiritual leader won't result in a neat, tidy, pro-Western revolution. Instead, it triggers a powerful sense of nationalism.
Blowback.
Massive blowback. He estimates an assassination like that will instantly enrage 40 to 50 million people. It becomes a unifying event of anger against an outside aggressor rather than a catalyst for democratic reform.
The enemy of my enemy doesn't always become my friend. Sometimes they just become a more motivated enemy.
Which means the strategy completely backfires. This raises an important question, and DeCourt points right to the historical track record to answer it.
The track record isn't great.
It is abysmal. The West has a terrible history when it comes to engineering forced regime change. He specifically lists out the past failures to prove his point. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Libya. Look at Serbia.
In Afghanistan, after 20 years of intervention, the Taliban returned to power.
Right.
In Libya, removing the leader resulted in long-term violent chaos and fractured militias. In each of these cases, the expectation of a swift transition to a friendly, stable democratic government completely fell apart.
So he views this entire strategy as a toxic cocktail of arrogance and ignorance. It is a mix of massive Western self-overestimation, the persistent belief that we can surgically re-engineer a foreign society,
combined with a profound underestimation of Iran's internal resilience, their military preparation, and their national pride.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads you to wonder, if these tactical realities about the economics of missile depletion, the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz, and the glaring historical failures of regime change are so obvious to a commentator like DeCourt,
why isn't everyone talking about it?
why on earth isn't this the main story on the evening news?
DeCourt has a scathing critique of the modern media ecosystem to answer that exact question.
The echo chamber.
The echo chamber. He argues that the mainstream media, and he specifically calls out both his native Dutch media and major U.S. outlets, are functioning within a massive, self-reinforcing bubble.
According to his analysis, deep investigative journalism on foreign policy has largely been replaced by a system where journalists are essentially just copy-pasting press releases handed to them by the U.S. Department of Defense.
Or smaller outlets just rely entirely on the narratives constructed by legacy papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post,
without ever doing their own independent verification of the logistics.
Right. He uses this very colorful analogy to describe the dynamic between reporters and politicians.
Jukebox analogy.
Yes. He says politicians today are treated by the media like jukeboxes, or, quote, boxes.
A quote box.
The journalist walks up, presses a button, the politician delivers a perfectly pre-packaged, slick, focus-grouped standbite about defending democracy or holding the line.
And then the journalist just dutifully writes it down and moves on to the next topic.
Exactly. What is missing in that transaction is the fundamental job of journalism, the follow-up question.
Nobody is asking the hard questions.
No one is stopping the quote box and saying, wait, what are the actual consequences of that policy you just announced? What are the mathematical costs in terms of defensive weaponry if we commit to this?
What is our long-term exit strategy if this forced regime change goes wrong, just like it did in Libya?
DeCourt argues that the media simply accepts the PR spin without ever demanding the leaders explain the logistical realities behind it.
And it gets worse for anyone who tries to step outside that neat, prepackaged narrative.
Oh, absolutely.
Because let's say a journalist or a military analyst actually does bring up the cost of interceptors or points out the hypocrisy in international law. DeCourt notes that you aren't met with a rigorous debate on the facts.
No. Instead, you are simply labeled a wappie.
A wappie, which is Dutch slang that translates essentially to a crazy person, a crank, or a conspiracy theorist.
Once that label is applied, you are canceled. You are entirely pushed out of the acceptable bounds of conversation.
It functions as a highly effective defense mechanism for the consensus.
It really does. Because if you label the dissenting voice as fundamentally unserious or crazy, you never have to actually engage with the uncomfortable data they are presenting.
You don't have to defend your naive assumptions about regime change.
And you certainly don't have to explain the terrifying depletion rate of your million-dollar air defenses. You just dismiss the messenger, and the echo chamber remains intact.
So, what does this all mean? When we look at all these pieces together, the terrifying math of missile economics, the glaring hypocrisy on the global stage, the historical amnesia regarding regime change, and a media apparatus that actively refuses to ask the hard questions.
It paints a grim picture.
It does. Decourt's core warning becomes incredibly clear. The West is walking completely blindly into an intractable, unwinnable conflict. And we are doing it because our leaders and our media institutions refuse to look at the cold, hard, logistical, and historical facts.
Preferring the comfort of their own ideologies and prepackaged quotes.
Exactly.
And bringing this directly back to you, the listener. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum or how you personally view the nations involved in this conflict, Decourt's critique serves as a highly practical reminder for how we consume information.
It really is a call to actively seek out primary data.
Yes. When you hear about a conflict, look for the logistical realities. Look up the missile capacities. Check the manufacturing production rates. Review the historical track records of similar foreign policies.
Do this rather than relying solely on the polished narratives handed down by, quote, box politicians and repeated by echo chamber media.
Because the math usually tells the real story, long before the politicians are willing to admit it.
Which leaves us with a final lingering question to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. If modern warfare is increasingly becoming a brutal game of economics,
A reality where an adversary can use incredibly cheap, mass-produced offensive drones and rockets to completely deplete incredibly expensive, hard-to-manufacture defensive interceptors.
how does that fundamentally rewrite the balance of global power for the rest of the 21st century? If the shield costs 100 times more than the sword, who actually holds the long-term advantage?
It is a profound shift in the mechanics of global security, and one that requires a complete rethinking of how wealthy nations project power and protect their interests.
It changes everything. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a new, more analytical lens through which to view the headlines. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the sound bites for the actual data, and we will catch you next time.